So again, launching a podcast is easy, but I'm about to show you just exactly how easy it can be. So to start things off, you've got a problem, right? That's why you're here. You need a vehicle for thought leadership and authentic conversation, right? You need to build authenticity. You need to build authoritative leadership through your content. And again, vehicle is the key word here, right? You need content that's going to carry your message for you, advance your brand, and do it in a consistent way, in a packaged way, right? Where storytelling and narrative does a lot of the lift for you. Now, why is this so important, right? This may seem a little redundant, but let's break down the real why behind we're even thinking about launching something like a podcast, right? Well, maybe you're lacking some humanity in your content. Things are a little stiff, and you need to bring that authenticity, that grittiness, the real voices of your community, internal and external. Maybe your content is a little shallow. It's lacking some narrative depth, right? You make good content, but is it really getting into the weeds of what your audience wants to hear? Speaking of audience, maybe you need to create a place for your fans, your community to go and actually subscribe, build some consistency, and for you to develop more of a parasocial relationship, honestly, right? Where they can feel like they're tapping into you, the brand, as something alive, not something static. This is also important because creating content shouldn't just be sporadic all the time, starting from scratch. Okay, time for the next product launch, the next piece of content, the next blog, the next this, right? When everything's ad hoc and it's not recurring, you're going to have a lack of planning, which is going to mean a lack of consistency, a lack of buy-in from your audience, and it's going to mean a lack of purpose-driven content. So that's the problem, right? This is key. You have a lack of purpose-driven content. So what's the solution here? That's why you're here, right? Podcasting. Let's go. Podcasting is truly a flexible, malleable, and community-driving content solution for meeting all of those challenges head on and giving you something that can really carry a lot of that content and community engagement lift for you. So here are the things a podcast can do, right? It can create staying power by being a platform itself. It can build authenticity and authority for you through thought leadership. So rather than just always releasing content about your products and services, you're releasing content about real things that your audience wants to hear about, trends, topics, timely news, technology, right? A podcast can build momentum, consistency, and discipline in your podcast release schedule and your content output. Keeps that train chugging and keeps folks engaged with that natural cadence. Oh, it's the 15th. I can expect another podcast from XYZ, right? It's going to platform your community, your internal and external voices. Again, it's going to build consistency, which is key for any successful content marketing campaign. And more importantly, it's going to be a Thanksgiving turkey for your turkey sandwiches. It's going to feed a whole ecosystem of content because you record one podcast episode. Now you've got sound bites. Now you've got chapters for educational content. Now you've got something to feed a white paper or a blog or some, unique and really engaging gamified content on social. So again, a podcast can do a lot for you. And as we're going to break down today, MarketScale Studio can help take some of that lift off of just executing on the recording itself, as well as consistency around branding and output. So let's get into the actual weeds here and get started and help you go from idea to show. So I don't want to overcomplicate this either. And so I'm going to hammer this home a lot, right? The short story here is that you should literally just get started. Okay, we're going to be breaking down a lot of like how to think of your audience and the gear you need and, how to actually record your content, what topics to hit on. But don't let perfection paralyze you from actually doing content, okay? Because it's honestly just like going to the gym. You could build out your whole workout plan. You could get yourself primed with, okay, I got to get my protein shake. I got to make sure I'm eating eggs in the morning. Okay, yes, all of that matters, but if the, going 0 to 1 is too complex and too much of a lift, you're never going to get it done. So I recommend just getting in MarketScale Studio and starting to record some content. Even if you don't have all of this figured out yet, what's great about podcasts is that you can always iterate on them, right? Don't let the weight of it keep you from building that muscle of recording podcast content, getting comfortable with communicating in front of the mic, getting conversational, right? Podcasts, again, can iterate on themselves because there's always new seasons. So you could do sort of a trial. Season 1, take notes, iterate, make changes on the gear, the flow, the feel, and then you launch season 2. Now you've got that next chapter that takes on a few more elements that make you feel more confident about your output. But again, just get the show going. Yeah, jump in, record a conversation, and build. So it's important, too, when we talk about what to do with a podcast, it's important to kind of nix some of the ideas that we see sometimes clients jump onto as, oh, we should put this kind of content into a podcast, right? So I'm going to break down to you what a podcast shouldn't be, what it isn't, and what it's not. Now, this content I'm going to give as examples doesn't mean that this is bad content, right? That content serves a role. But ask yourselves, does it serve a role in a podcast, right? That's the key here. You're building what we described as a hub of community engagement, thought leadership, right? Consistency. Are these other things playing a useful role in that hub? Maybe not, right? So here's what I think a podcast shouldn't be. A podcast is not a place to show off all your services, right? You shouldn't be treating your podcast like just a hub to talk about, all right, so something that we like to do as a company is this. Hey, Bob, you are the leader of that department. Tell us why that's a really great service, right? Folks can learn what you do in much simpler ways and can get themselves educated on your services. So I wouldn't put all of your services as episodes into your podcast. It's just not that engaging on its face. To be quite honest, that kind of content doesn't build community because it's a bit self-serving, right? You shouldn't be treating your podcast like a product demo. It's not a show off for here's how our tech works. There's other content that can do that in a much more exciting, energetic, hype way, whether we're talking 3D content, whether we're talking a fast-paced edit of an actual product demo with multiple camera angles, or even something on the ground, right? Social video, mobile phone video of your product in action, breaking down how it works. All of that is much more engaging than doing like a step-by-step product demo in a podcast format, right? A podcast shouldn't be a commercial or an ad, right? So don't treat your podcast like a way to just sort of announce that there's a new product. There's, again, more engaging ways to do that. Your podcast shouldn't be the vehicle for that. And then just overall, get out of the headspace that your podcast is a selfie, that you're turning the camera inward and showing off all the cool things you are, your services, your products, right? You need to be thinking about how can you communicate all of that authority you have in the industry more naturally through good content. And good content is going to have good stories, good topics, good people behind them. They're going to be timely. They're going to be impactful, right? They're going to be true thought leadership. So if you want to point the camera inward, think about how the act of actually scanning the field of other community members, other important topics outside of the direct sort of, hub of your HQ, how that can be the impetus for good conversation for a podcast. Now, of course, if you're making an internal sort of culture podcast, then yeah, okay, maybe that warrants pointing the camera inward a little bit. But even then, the point of culture content is usually not to just tell your employees about how awesome you are, right? It's about highlighting your employees, what makes them excited, their pop culture interests, their favorite meals to cook, real things that communicate culture beyond just talking about yourselves to yourselves, right? So again, a podcast is not a selfie. So now let's actually get into building your podcast, right? Where do you start? I like to start when I'm creating any kind of podcast and guiding folks to create a podcast. First things first is choose your audience. I've created a lot of podcasts myself. I've got my nice little podcast setup here. Hopefully that communicates some authority. But I've also helped clients host their podcasts and guide them to podcast success. And the podcasts that are most effective are the ones that choose a clear audience first. Who do they want to reach with this content, right? As marketers, you should already have a good understanding of who your audience is. So now it's just about crystallizing how that translates to a content audience, right? So ask yourself some key questions. Who are you actually really trying to reach with this content? Who are you trying to educate? Who are you trying to engage, right? Which community specifically needs some stimulation? So you may be a company that has a lot of different types of clients. So maybe you hone in on one sector that really needs some stimulation, right? You could be a software company that works with healthcare or works with education and works with the public sector. But it's the healthcare sector where, the upside is really clear for new sales, but that community is a bit disengaged. They don't know that y'all speak healthcare, right? So create some content that connects with them. What does your audience want to learn? What do they want to be entertained by? What do they want to feel closer to, right? Really put yourselves in the shoes of a content consumer here. And then what actually matters to your audience at a practical and a personal level, right? What stories are going to get them to feel? That's what matters in a podcast. Storytelling and narrative, right? And the way you capture a good story and a good narrative is by first having a strong focus on who's going to receive that in the first place, right? If you're giving a tearjerker story, but your audience doesn't really care to be emotionally moved, they need practical insights on how to apply some new trend to their, financial strategies, then maybe a tearjerker is just going to feel like a waste of time. Or the flip, right? So again, analyze your audience, understand what they really want to engage with, what's going to make them tick and make them, really engage with your content like you're a YouTuber and you're giving them solid content to subscribe and engage with. Have a strong focus. Okay, now you've got your audience figured out, right? Now you want to name your show. You want to capture the vibe your show, right? What does that really mean in practice? Well, you should ask yourselves, is your content, is your podcast going to match your existing brand? You already have a strong content brand and you're just sort of building on it with a podcast, or are you advancing and pushing your brand into new territories with a podcast? That's key, right? Because a podcast can do a lot to bring that needed humanity and conversation and authenticity to your content. So there may be new territories, new feels, new vibes that your brand doesn't communicate yet that your podcast can. What's the mission or goal of your podcast, right? What kind of mission or goal does it need to reflect, right? Is it a company mission, or is there a specific goal that my podcast is meant to activate this community and engage them through, personalized testimonial style stories? Great. So how does the brand reflect that, right? And then what's going to catch your audience's eye visually and aesthetically? That matters. Right? Each industry has some of its own trends. Demographics are different, whether that's gender demographics or age demographics or regional demographics. Those things impact how you want to craft your vibe. So here are some examples, right? These are all client podcasts with MarketScale. We have helped them develop these brands, and they have, obviously taken charge of planting their flag in creating a cool new brand. So what are some examples here, that we see in action, right? What are we seeing in practice here? Well, we're seeing a lot of catchy names, right? Consensus. The company name is Census. They're building a podcast there where the theme is about creating consensus, through their podcast, right? It's punny, it's catchy, and it has the brand baked in. Nice. Healthcare on Air by Verizon here, right? Really simple, clean branding. Nothing too fancy. It's actually pretty, just here's text on a black background. But that brand speaks so loudly. It's Verizon. The logo does so much talking for them. That crisp, clean, white on black is impactful, right?
Figure it out.
Why bring a bunch of new layers into the mix when you already have a strong brand? So sometimes you don't need to push the mantle that hard. You've got School Safety Today there, right? Nice, bright, saturated colors. Everyone knows, gym coach saying, let's pick up the pace, boys and girls. We're used to the loudspeaker, right? So let's bring that vibe into our branding. I also really like what Gossip About Gossip does here. Hedera is an innovative blockchain industry company. And so they named their podcast Gossip About Gossip. What does that have to do with anything? Well, it's a bit of a wink and a nod to the audience because gossip is a type of peer-to-peer communication type between computers and other digital devices. And their blockchain, their hash graph, is built using that gossip communication type, that gossip model. Gossip protocol is what it's actually referred to technically. So, little gossip about gossip. It brings a light feel to the podcast, means you're going to get some kind of off the cuff, authentic, maybe spicy conversations. And it's about gossip, right? An industry term that kind of carries some weight for itself, a little double entendre. So a lot of options here, a lot of examples of branding that does the speaking for you. And again, that connects with the audience. Crisp, clear titles, catchy names, clear branding, a clear focus, right? Communicated through the title. And so how do you get to these good ideas? I recommend start with ChatGPT. I mean, honestly, some of it's going to be a little clunky, but leaning on just something to get the wheels turning is not a bad idea. I often start with podcast names and show name ideas with a little ChatGPT magic. Also, poll your team. You'd be surprised, if you're struggling to come up with a good podcast vibe or name, maybe your team actually has a better sense for content that is catchy right now, especially your, junior level marketers or your younger hires who maybe consume this, style of podcast content more authentically. Maybe they're tapped into really cool YouTube personalities who have great show names. Lean on your whole company for inspiration because you'd be surprised. And last but not least, alliteration, rhymes, and puns are always a great place to start. Healthcare on air, right? Gossip about gossip, ba-doom, right? Consensus, right? School, safety today, wavelengths, right? All of these things kind of either connect with a specific technical term in the audience. They have a wink and a nod to the audience. They're a pun in and of themselves. They've got a little rhyme. Think catchy and, have some fun with it. This is where you really want to have fun and try to connect with your audience. Step 3. This is a big one. You want to choose your topics or the people, right? The things that are going to carry the content forward. So let's get a little more specific here, right? Interesting topics and interesting people feed interesting stories, right? Now, the best combo here is that you've got interesting people on your podcast and they can speak to really interesting topics. But that's sometimes a bigger lift than it sounds, right? Finding a great voice, whether that's a host or guests, and having them speak authoritatively to really interesting, impactful topics. So I like to recommend sometimes even just starting with one of the two, right? Identify strong people. They could be hosts who are going to bring some personality and inject some vibes into the conversation, into the content, or guests, right? Folks in your community, subject matter experts or folks outside of the community, clients, people you work with, who are going to do a lot of the carrying for you, a lot of the storytelling for you, or they're going to bring that energy that you need to build interest in your podcast. So identify the strong people and then ask yourself, what do they want or what can they speak to? And then start to build some topics around that. Or the flip, identify strong, impactful topics that are of consequence to your audience, and then identify, who can speak to those topics. So at least get yourself one or the other. And here are some great examples of, what makes for an interesting topic or an interesting person. Timely news, right? If it's on the calendar, people are likely going to turn their heads to see what that is all about, right? Or it relates to something that's coming up that is pressing for your audience. Identify core industry trends. If there's some new research, maybe even new legislation that's dropping in your industry, Bring that to light and be the voice that, starts the conversation around it. Maybe there's a major trade show coming up. You want to do some pre-show content, right? Start bringing some folks that are organizing the show onto your podcast. Industry debate, right? That's a big one. If there's already a juicy topic shaping your industry, is Dolby Atmos really all that hot, right? Pro AV professionals are debating it out. Why don't you host a debate on your podcast where you bring some dissenting and supportive voices to hash it out? So good topics. And then people, right? SMEs, obviously. Maybe there's some influencers in your industry already. Platform them. They carry their own audience, right, that you can lean on. Infectious personalities. If you've got two people at your company who just their vibe is unmatched, right? My two college roommates, separately, they're fun people. Yeah, I love them. But together, it's like literally a TV show, so seeing the way that they bounce off of each other and the dynamics they have. You may have something like that at your company. Create some content with them, put them in the host seat and let them vibe it out. Even if it's not that directly related to any of the core topics of your industry, leaning on infectious personalities to build interest in your brand is huge. And it plays on that influencer content world that dominates today, right? Great media often starts with great people first that, you as an audience member feel you can relate to. Successful community members, your clients, right? Maybe if they have good testimonials or success stories, implementations of your product, right? Telling their stories. Those could be tear jerkers. Those could be practical stories. Those could be, we grew our company 10x after using your software type stories. Lean on that. And then innovators and young voices. Platform the new blood, the fresh blood at your companies, because I'm telling you, the more that you can show off some of the authentic and, most cutting edge content styles and slang even, that is, building this next generation of professionals in the workplace, right? The oldest Gen Zers and the youngest millennials who are now stepping into management roles at companies, right? Or are starting their own companies as the next entrepreneurs. They've got a good vibe, right? Lean on them. So again, interesting topics and or interesting people are going to feed your interesting stories. And that's what you want. You want your podcast to give an interesting story. All right. Step 4 is now you want to build your cadence and the structure of your podcast. This is important for the consistency and the repeatability of what you're doing. Podcasts are best when they are scheduled, when an audience can subscribe and truly anticipate what's coming. You don't want to do 3 episodes in 1 week and then they never hear from you again until 3 months later you start up another series. That's not a great way to build consistency. That's the whole point of a podcast. So build your cadence, build your structure. How often do you plan to record and release? Those could be 2 different things. You could record in bulk 10 episodes in 1 month and then pace them out once a month following that bulk recording, right? So how often do you plan to record and release? Frequency and consistency is key here for your own peace of mind. How realistic is it to execute on that cadence, right? Oh, I want to record every day. Okay, good luck. I hope you've got someone ready to execute on that, right? So be realistic. And it's always an option to increase your cadence, right? You can always add more to the plate, but decreasing your cadence can be damaging to your brand and kill momentum. So start in a realistic place and build. Don't overcomplicate it and say, I got to release a podcast every week if you realistically can't execute on that. Because if you then tone it back, you do once a week for a month and then you go to once a month, you might kill some authentic momentum that you've built and some goodwill that you've built with your audience. So here are some options, right, that I typically recommend. Twice a week is ballistic, but hey, we have clients that do twice a week podcasts and they do them consistently. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, and it's a great way to feed the machine. Once a week, obviously. I'm kind of an every other week guy. I feel like that's pretty consistent, but it gives some pacing for you to prep and book, all the people you need on the podcast, align on topics, etc. Then there's once a month. Once a month is probably the longest that I would recommend releasing your like the longest cadence, right? For releasing your podcast episodes. Main reason being once you start releasing podcast content with more gap time in between, you don't build any momentum. It's too much of a break between episodes for there to be, actual burning desire to tap into your content. If you're doing more than once a month, you may want to think about this being a different type of content, right? A different piece of content. It could be like big roundtable style episodes that you do once every 2 months and you build a lot of momentum around those. Something like that, right? So these are my typically recommended cadences. Then there's the structure of your podcast, right? Determining the format is really important, right? What will your podcast sound like? How will it literally be structured as a literal piece of content? And can you match that with your cadence, right? How is the structure of your podcast going to impact the production of a single episode? And can you replicate that with the cadence that you've set for yourself? So here are some structure ideas, right? You can do one-on-one interviews. Those are very common, right? You could do roundtable debates where you bring, 3 guests onto a hosted discussion. You can do the Rogan style free flow. You bring the vibes to an open mic conversation and you just run with it. That one is hit or miss, right? You got to really have some good personalities or some spicy topics to hit on for it to do the talking for you. You could do a hosted news show. It's just a host. They sit down and it's almost radio show style. Welcome to your weekly minute from XYZ company. Here are the top news stories impacting our industry and why they matter to you. Boom, right? That's really impactful content and can be a podcast. But you got to do a lot of research with that one, right? You got to align the news stories. You got to be plugged into what's happening in your industry. So you're starting to see what are the moving pieces here, right? A one-on-one interview podcast, you book 1 guest. A roundtable debate, you book 3. A free flow, you got to really lean on the personalities, right? Are they going to be free and energetic enough to deliver that vibe every episode? News show is research oriented. A narrative audio show, a lot of post-production going into this, right? That's going to take a while. Immersive audio experience, if you're doing like, I don't know, like a really experimental kind of Foley, you're doing an audiobook almost, right? That's a podcast. That could be really cool. Some Nat Geo style content for a manufacturing podcast or something, right? On the factory floor with Tim Jones or whatever, right? But that's going to take a lot of asset capture, quality post-production. So are you prepared to meet that cadence? So again, structure and cadence need to be linked and be realistic. Okay, so you've got the plan now. You've got your audience. You've got your name and vibe. You've got your topics and people. And you've got your cadence and structure mapped out. So you've got all your moving pieces now. You've mapped it out. So now it's time to hit the ground running and build out your show. So next up is you need some assets, right? Some branding direction. You likely already have this. This is things like logos, colors. You maybe already have a brand guideline PDF built out for your company. Perfect. That's probably a great place to start for the basics. What's great is that MarketScale will take on the responsibility of designing your branding for you. So you don't need to now concern yourself with going from scratch and building, the look, the look of the actual logo for your show or the lower thirds or the templates and the look of the content itself. We will design that branding for you. We just need direction from you on all of this planning you've put together. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate
questions and stuff to do.
You can also just record content without all of this. You can get started, sit down with an SME, record a conversation, and turn it into a podcast. And we can play a little catch up here, right? We can figure out things like, okay, let's fine tune the next episode around a clearer audience. Are we sure that's the host you want to do? Are they going to have the right vibe? Maybe let's switch it up. Again, podcasts can be iterative. So don't let all of this hold you back. But let's say you've done all the great planning. You've got your audience, topics, people, everything. So now let's design your branding, right? So here are the assets we need from you. Make note of this one. Shoot an email over to support@marketscale.com, right? Again, an email to support@marketscale.com with some of the following stuff that you've already mapped out for yourself. What's the name of your show? What's the vibe, right? Do you have an audience clear? Who is that? Maybe any look or design inspiration, other podcasts where you feel like, yeah, that sleek aesthetic matches, or that bright, colorful visual language really matches what we're going for. Send us some of that inspiration. Do you have planned topics? If so, that might let us pepper in some cool graphics, or kind of a hint, nod to the audience about what's to come, intrinsic in the branding. And then your basics. Give us the logo, the fonts, the colors, things you want us to use on that front. If you don't have any real logos, fonts, or colors that you want us to go, imagination land and really cook up something fresh, we can also do that, right? So as much of this as you can give us, great, but there's obviously also some flex. We will develop some cool stuff based on the direction you give us. So now that you've sent us all of this, we will design the content. And again, within about a week or so, you're going to have branding to review. And then we'll load it into MarketScale Studio for you in your brand book. You likely already have a brand book for your company. It's sort of a generalized brand book, but we build out brand books for specific shows as well to make the editing process straightforward. You hit edit, you hit the brand book, and it's always going to kind of look the same, right? So you can upload things like your logos, right? Your color palettes, fonts, graphics, imagery, intro and outro stingers, music, and you could even drop example clips for we want it to look and feel like this every time. And you can access those brand books by clicking on your little face up here and going down to brand books and building out your own. So again, structured, repeatable, that's the magic of a podcast. And so we help set that up for you. Okay, next up, this is the fun stuff, gear, right? It's time to record some content. What gear should you invest in or prioritize to record your content? So there's a lot of directions we could take this. Like this alone could be its own webinar. So I'm going to try to simplify this a bit. Most of our clients' podcasts are recorded virtually. And the reality is that yours probably will be too. You may have some content that you record with multiple people around a table, at like a physical location somewhere. Maybe you'll come into MarketScale Studio and record in our fun studio suites. But to build consistency, right? Virtual is probably the way to go because you can scale that a little easier. So I'm going to be walking you through some of the core things to do if you're setting up a virtual podcast. So some of the core basic gear and setup direction you need. So webcam, USB microphone, or an audio interface with an XLR microphone, right? That's sort of the next tier up, and it creates the infrastructure for potentially having two mics recording at once for like an in-person conversation, right? You're going to need some headphones, straightforward enough, some subject lighting, and a set somewhere to record that you feel confident about. So here are some recommendations from me. Webcams. You're going to see here there's a lot of options for all of these with a lot of price ranges. On the webcam, realistically, you should go 1080p to start. The standard today is obviously recording in 4K, but a lot of the content you release that's like a podcast is not going to be viewed in 4K. Most people are still viewing content in 1080p. So you don't need to break the bank to record in 4K. You can record in 1080. And a lot of the like software that's used to record usually just records in 1080p anyways. So we recommend 1080. Logitech is one of my go-tos, right? They have a good cost spread of options as well as 1080 versus 4K. And you can see, right, you can pay $60 for a 1080, 140 for a 4K. Then there's the Opal. That's actually what I use here. It's basically a DSLR quality webcam, but it's $300. So a bit of a heavier lift, maybe not in your price range. But if you're trying to really go ham with your host setup and you want a quality virtual setup that's going to communicate like a studio setup, the Opal is pretty powerful. So I recommend that one. But again, Logitech has some good options and good spread of quality and price options. Next up, microphones. This is literally my like Bible of recommending podcast microphones. Check out this website, thepodcasthost.com. I recommend it all the time. It's got great direction on microphones to use. And this article specifically is perfect. It gives so many options. They get really detailed on the cons and the pros of each mic to match your needs. So there's so many options, but here are some that stand out to me specifically. These are some USB microphones that can just plug into your computer and you can start recording. I recommend this one a lot. That's what I'm using right here. It's the Blue Yeti. It's sort of the standard entry level for quality, but not break the bank. Right. But you can see here, there are other options. And with microphones, even more so than webcams, in my opinion, you get what you pay for. Because with microphones, what you're doing is you're controlling how good the mic is at isolating your voice. How sensitive is it? And how much is it also just going to pick up all of the tinny reverberation around you? Especially with a podcast, especially when audio is still, I mean, even though most podcasts are video too nowadays, but when audio is what really carries the essence of quality for your podcast, I recommend putting a little extra down on the mic versus, even the lighting or the webcam. So these are all decent. This is sort of my recommendation for the best entry level, but still good quality. Now, if you want to look at the real industry standard, it's the SM7B. It's $500. Yikes, right? But this thing is the microphone for professional podcasters, for musicians, for recording artists. This mic is awesome. I recommend this microphone if you want to go like, I'm super serious about your podcast. It's the industry standard. But if you do something like this, or even if you do a slightly less expensive version of an XLR microphone, right? Not USB, but XLR, you're going to need an audio interface setup as well. So you'll see here, an audio interface essentially is going to feed the connection of an XLR microphone into your computer. And what this does is it gives you access to higher quality microphones. You're just going to get a better signal feeding through a machine like this. And it opens up the possibilities for multiple microphones, right? For doing an in-person podcast where you've got two people and you want to level up your podcast game to be an in-person conversation. So again, this is great if you're trying to lay the foundations for an in-person podcast, or you're just super serious about, you want to launch into the best of the best. Headphones are less important. If you're doing like ASMR style content, you want to invest in something really solid, right? So that you can really get a feel for the quality of the audio, something like studio standard. But for most of the podcasting you're going to be doing, you just need to be able to detect what your voice sounds like as you're recording, and be able to isolate audio so it's not feeding back into your microphone as you're talking virtually with other guests. So any of these will do, right? And you'll see there's a good, decent spread. I usually recommend these Sony headphones. Let's see here. They're about $100 or a little more expensive, but these are studio grade. So they will isolate sound really well, and they're comfortable on the head. I use these at home when I do my gaming and my podcasting and my voiceovers. So I love this set here. But also hosts need that vibe, right? And headphones kind of communicate that vibe a lot. So if you're wearing these big clunkers and, it just feels awkward for you, maybe you don't want big clunky headphones. So pick headphones that match your vibe, because that's important, right? And wireless is okay here. If really all you're trying to do is isolate audio, AirPods is fine. Your Bose wireless headphones are fine. Your in-ears are fine. It may not be as professional looking, but maybe that's not the goal you're going for. You want something sleek. Instead, you want it to look kind of as I'm just a person behind a microphone, not like I'm locked into a studio. So gear should also kind of match your vibe. And the same goes for microphones, right? All of these communicate a very different look and feel. So pick a microphone, pick gear that matches the vibe you're trying to communicate with your podcast. Speaking of vibe, Oh, let's go back to that one. Set examples here, right? You want to set up a set where, you can host with confidence. Not every guest needs this, right? But your host should have some kind of setup that feels intentional. That's the key word here, intentionality. So intentionality can be, a simple background with some colored lighting. It could be a flat background with a plant. It could be a full-on living room looking setup. It could be a more casual, decorated, couch style setup. Whatever it is, you want to communicate intentionality. But let me stress again, simple is fine. Don't overcomplicate this, okay? Basic sets are okay. You can just be in front of a mic with a little splash of lighting behind you, and that's enough. That's intentional, right? Simple is okay as long as it's intentional. And look at that smile. He's clearly happy in that set. Okay, now it's time to record, y'all. Let's get to actually executing on the content. So you've got all of your stuff set up. It's time to record your first episode. So this is where you're going to want to turn to MarketScale Studio and record your first episode using the conversation room in MarketScale Studio. This is built in to every org in Studio. Every user has the capacity to leverage this, whether you're an admin or you're an external user. So right there at the top is our conversation room. It takes you to our recording room here where you title your room. You add up to 4 people. It could be, host and 3 guests. You could be a marketer who's just setting things up, and you actually remove yourself from here and add someone else who's the host and some other guests, right? And then here's what it looks like when you're in the room. You've got 4 different squares. Let's say someone hasn't joined yet. You can resend the invite. Lets you know if they're muted or not. You can choose your basics like any recording room and start recording. And all of this content records high quality, separate video and audio, so you can leverage it and get dynamic with your edit, and you're not stuck with like a gallery view like here in Zoom or something, right? Where you got to punch in to a potato quality of a recording and try to make that a podcast. I'm going to fly through some recording tips here. This is key for the host. You do not want to be a host for your podcast and then be looking or presenting at a lower standard than your guests. Anticipate that more and more, especially folks that take themselves really seriously with their careers, if you're bringing them on as an external party and they value joining podcasts, they're probably going to have a solid setup and they will have thought through their presentation. So you don't want to look unprofessional compared to your guests. You're the host. You want to communicate authority. That can be simple authority, but again, it's intentionality. So here are some tips on how to present yourself confidently. Okay. Here is a bad setup. Okay. If you were the host and this was you as the host, you're not going to be communicating a lot of authority. Why? Bad framing. I'm shoved away in the corner. Bad lighting, right? I'm being attacked with overhead lighting and I don't have anything in front of my face, so you got weird shadows. Bad microphone. I'm using my old Apple earbuds and I'm having to hold it like this. Tacky. Doesn't look good. Bad background. I've got the sales team chilling behind me and they're going to be loud and they're celebrating wins and they're on calls. So not only is it noisy, but it just doesn't look professional. Bad setup, right? Weak. Weak setup. So what makes for a good setup? This is bad lighting, right? Overheads, dim, grainy, nothing shining on my face to separate me from my background. Here's good lighting. Lighting is focused on me, right? Even if there are still a few shadows, right? That's okay as long as the main subject is the face. And like where I'm recording literally right now is not the best representation either, right? Look at all that backlighting. Horrible, really bright, way brighter than my face here, right? So I wouldn't host a podcast from my desk here because you can't control the variables here. You want your face, your subject to be the best lit thing as host. Speaking of, you don't want bad background lighting, right? If your background is really bright, a lot of times people think, I want to film in front of a window because there's a cool thing behind me, right? We're on floor 53 of the Bank of America Plaza building. I'm going to brag a little bit. We have some of the best views in Dallas. We can scan the whole skyline and even look all the way to Arlington and like the blip of Fort Worth. But unfortunately, you need really high quality cameras and insanely good lighting to be able to not only capture what's outside the window as well as have your subject lit. So don't backlight yourself where the background is going to be way more, shiny than you. Also with backgrounds, you want it to be intentional. This isn't an atrocious background, but it's a little cluttered and kind of unfocused, right? It kind of looks like you're just filming in a random hallway. You've got random notes behind you. There's some cool lighting and stuff, but it clearly has nothing to do with you. You can see cables, exit signs, right? Not horrible, but just not intentional. But again, you don't need to go crazy with a set, right? I showed you some great set examples here, right? These all have a lot of decoration. Simple, clean, intentional decoration goes a long way. But you could literally have this as your background. A blank wall with a little splash of light. And that is good because it looks intentional. It kind of frames you as the host and it does the talking for you. Okay. Now, mic distance. This is key as well. This is bad mic placement. Way too close to the mic. It's kind of impeding with my look. It looks like it's about to punch me in the face. And you don't want hypersibilance. You don't want all of that to be so punchy and frustrating for your editors and for the listener because you were right on top of the microphone, right? This is also bad mic placement. And this is something I see a lot when folks get a nice microphone, but it's like, it's over here in the corner, right? Okay, great. But like, it's too far away. You're starting to pick up more, room noise, and your voice, you're picking up the reverb of it, not the actual source. So good placement is a decent distance away from the face and close enough, framed in a way that it isn't totally blocking your face, right? I don't want my microphone here, even though it is a little closer to my mouth, or covering half my face, right? Place it somewhere where it makes sense for your framing. So here it's kind of off to the side and pointed up, right? And I usually do like 3-finger distance from the microphone. That's usually a good amount of distance without destroying your listeners' ears with punchy sibilance. Then there's framing. This is important. You don't want to be low framing. I have 3 chins now. Bad look. It's not only not flattering, but it just feels amateur. There's a lot of folks I've seen sit down to record a podcast and their mic or their camera, is on a laptop and it's just kind of folded back and pointed up and it looks like they're looming over, right? And it just is not a good look, especially for a host. But then also you don't want it too high to where it looks like you're like peering up at the sun or you're tiny. And you also don't want to be in a corner. I've seen this a lot too, where folks kind of frame themselves up and they don't really think much about how am I positioning myself in the virtual frame, or they're not judicious about staying here. So they might be here and then by the end of the podcast, they've wound up over here because it's just more comfortable and they can kick back their legs, right? Not great. So be judicious about that and get yourself with eye level here. So let me point out a few things. Eye level, about center of the screen. You've got good headroom. You're in about the split between the top and the second third, right? If you imagine this in top, middle, and bottom third. And there's a decent sort of middle framing of me as host. I also showed you something where it's a little more distant like this. This is also okay. Basically frame yourself up to where you're centered. There's good headroom. You're more or less centered around this kind of first and second third. And then try to match up your size to the guest's size so that one person isn't this and then your guest is in the corner and is this tiny blip. You don't want to look like a giant and your guest look like a tiny person or something, right? So again, framing is important. Now let's get your episode edited. You've got it recorded. You've recorded it confidently. How do you get it scaled and edited? Well, luckily, like we explained, right, you've got content, brand books on the back end that structure the feel of all of your assets and the look of your show. So you don't need to overthink this. Once you've recorded your content in Studio, you'll go over to this media studio here. All right, you've now got this finished recorded conversation. You can listen to the audio preview. And now you've got this collaborative hub of editing where you submit your editing direction. You can leave time-coded notes here on any specific things like, oh, at 45 minutes, I have an atrocious cough. Please cut that out. Or maybe it's generalized direction like all of the ums and uhs should be cut out of this podcast, right? But whatever it is, you now have, and see here, the selected branding for the ABS podcast. You can get as intentional and granular or as just, let's cookie cutter this. This is another episode. It's more or less the same, doesn't change much. I want that branding. Give us the typical stuff and hit submit and edit, right? And then you get back a finished piece where you can do picture-in-picture style stuff, right? Where you line up with all of your guests. You got the frames, you've got the logos, and now you've got an edited solid piece of content. But editing your content isn't just getting the video done, right? Which is, again, straightforward. Record it, fill in the edit form, make sure you got your brand book ready to go, and you send it off, and you've got solid content. But it's also the ecosystem of content around your podcast, especially written content. So if you're unfamiliar with it, we've recently launched AI Writer, or sort of our video to text tool, and our collaborative docs tool, both within Studio. What this does is it gives you the power of AI-assisted written generation, as well as collaborative docs like Google Docs, to make sure that you can build out all the multimedia assets for your podcast as well, all within the same hub, all built into the same video card, essentially, for your video. So you got your proofing room, and you've also got the AI Writer and Docs. So it's all localized, right? But decentralized in the sense that you can bring a lot of people to the table to help. So with AI Writer, you can, again, start with your content. All this content gets a transcript. You download that transcript. And this is, again, like really, really effective transcript here. We're talking like 99% accurate. That transcript can be found in the proofing room as well. And then using AI Writer, you can ask it to generate for you, leveraging the transcript, leveraging the unique insights of that hour-long podcast you just recorded. A blog post, for example. You could generate a video summary for Spotify. You could generate a LinkedIn post as well. Or you could customize your prompt, right? You can send over really specific, like, I want my first paragraph like this, third paragraph like this, et cetera, et cetera. Boom, it generates it for you, right? That's how I use it. I like really specific prompting. And this is all first-party insights, right? And then you can store multiple of these write-ups, all of the multimedia assets for the launch of your episode now made simple and collaborative. And speaking of collaborative, the Docs tool lets you actually bring more people to the table to collaborate on those pieces of written content, because a lot of times you got to get sign-off from multiple teammates. So you can send that generated content to the Docs feature, which then brings it into this space. Whereas you can see we've got two users online here, right? Ben Thomas over here, me over here, two users, right? And now you can, in real time, collaborate on that piece of content. You can also use AI tools to translate chunks of your write-up or simplify language or emojify it, right? More AI to make it simpler for you to experiment and get what you need in a collaborative fashion. And you can leave comments as well, right? Don't love when it uses burgeoning, my least favorite GPT word. It's like GPT's favorite. So get rid of burgeoning and add in more specifics from the interview, right? You can leave these notes. They can then be collaborated on and approved. You can version all of your write-ups. Done. Now you've got all your assets, and it's time to publish your first episode. When you go to publish your episode, MarketScale handles setting up your Spotify and Apple Podcast backend for you with our backend infrastructure. So you don't even need to worry about your podcast hitting the airwaves. All you need to do to get it published is send it to contributors@marketscale.com or get in touch with your point of contact at MarketScale. We'll handle publishing it for you, scheduling it out. And we help you build a show page too. We've got our publication where your post will live as a Google News indexed article for the extra SEO. But we'll also build you a show page where folks can subscribe and put in their email as you drop new episodes. And you'll have a video card here, a show card where you will live alongside some of the best of B2B content. And here's some of the feedback, right, on why podcasts are so powerful. These are some of our clients here, right? You can see not only huge visitor increases, but registration increases too, engagement of internal and external stakeholders, assisting in the top of funnel sales and lead generation process, year over year follower returns. Again, everything we were saying earlier. What matters about a podcast is that it's building consistency, it's telling good stories, and it's doing the brand building for you by leaning on thought leadership rather than the heavy hand of talking about your product or your service or, your great company culture or how sustainable you are. Those all play a role in different styles of content, but a podcast that prioritizes good storytelling and good thought leadership first and foremost is the magic sweet spot, because that's where you start to see these kinds of returns, because the content itself is just that dang good. But again, the short story here is just get started. Make a podcast. Don't overthink it. Record your first episode, and the rest will come as well. But if you want to get serious about it, you can sit down and map out this action plan and build a confident, successful, consistent, powerful, engaging podcast that now acts as a vehicle to communicate your brand goals and build an engaged community.